Thank you so much. That was such a generous introduction. And it's really great to be here. Thanks so much to the Carlsberg Foundation and to Professor Aldrin Nielsen for having me. So it's also my first time in Denmark, so this is very exciting for me. New place to explore. So the title of this talk, as advertised, is about social media and democracy, right? But hopefully not to disappoint you. To tell you the truth and to be perfectly clear up front, I don't study democracy. I don't know much about democracy. But I have worked extensively on social media in authoritarian regimes and on censorship, on propaganda, in particular in China. So I have this book that's coming out about censorship in China, and that's mostly what I think about. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is mostly about what I've found about social media and censorship in autocracies. And I want to persuade you that these findings matter, not just for authoritarian regimes, but also for how we think about our own experience with social media around the world. Okay. So in fact, I think there are sort of fewer differences. I hope that I will persuade you that there are sort of fewer differences between autocracies and democracies than in social media than you might have expected before. And so I think that media manipulation within China actually tells us a lot about where we see social media going in the US and in Europe also. So let me start with China, and I'll spend most of the time talking about my empirical findings about censorship and social media in China. And then I'll sort of end with some questions that I think this raises for our own experience with social media and democracies. So I don't know if you know much about the Chinese internet, but it is a really dynamic, interesting place to be right now. Okay? So if you talk to any investor, what they'll tell you is that some of the hottest markets in social media and in tech are in China. Okay? Some of the biggest companies, Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, these companies approximate the value of some of the largest internet companies in the world. So if you're a user on the Chinese internet, you're really in luck, because some of the most innovative platforms are actually happening in China right now. So I don't know if you guys have heard of Weixin or WeChat, but it's basically this extremely popular platform in China where you can chat with your friends, so it's kind of like WhatsApp. You can also share news, so it's also like Facebook. You can catch a cab, so it's also like Uber, and you can do things like order a passport and that type of thing. So there's some of the most interesting social media platforms, even more than what we have in the US and around the world. So the Chinese internet is also extremely huge. So I'll just give you this quote, and let me find my clicker here. This quote by Lu Wei, who's the former director of the State Internet Information Office. And he said, China has 4 million websites, has nearly 700 million internet users, 1.2 billion mobile phone users, 600 million WeChat and Weibo users, and generates 30 billion pieces of information every day. Okay, so this is a huge, dynamic, and interesting space. So where's the paradox? So at the same time that this really exciting, dynamic, innovative internet space is happening, the Chinese government is known to run one of the most extensive censorship systems in history on the Chinese internet. Okay? So the Chinese government jails and intimidates social media users. It blocks foreign websites from entering China using the Great Firewall, which you may have heard of. It employs thousands of censors to individually remove social media posts from the web, to go in and take them down one by one. It uses search filtering to reorder search results so that certain results go to the top and certain results go to the bottom. And it hires government astroturfers, so it pays people to post things on the web to distract from ongoing events. So this is a huge operation. It's a lot of effort, and it costs lots and lots of money every year to do all of these types of activities. So here's the paradox. So how can one of the most sort of dynamic internet marketplaces also be one of the most areas of most heavy-handed repression, right? We usually think of heavy-handed regulation to go on with less dynamic marketplaces. And certainly, we would think that repression sort of would force risk-averse consumers sort of off of the internet. So if you know that there's all of the censorship going on, maybe you don't want to use the internet anymore. So how do these two things coexist? And why does the government try to censor something that we might think is really uncensorable? So 30 billion pieces of information every day, right? How are censors going to go and remove all of that information that they find objectionable? So one answer that a lot of pundits have put forward to this paradox is basically that censorship just doesn't work, okay? So for example, in a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, James Zimmerman notes that the Great Firewall is ineffective. Almost anyone, including journalists, academics, and government officials in China, can bypass the censors and access foreign sources of information through a virtual private network or a VPN. So basically, what he's saying is that censorship in China is circumventable, which it certainly is. So if you want, the Great Firewall blocks certain websites from China, but you can get around it by just logging into a computer outside of China, and then you can see the whole internet through that, right? So you can just get around censorship. And so his answer is that, look, the Chinese government is trying to censor the internet, but they can't, and that's why it's so dynamic. Okay? So that's one side of the answer to this paradox. On the other side, there are other pundits who think that actually the answer to this paradox is that censorship is perfect. Okay? So that fear purifies the internet in China. So in a recent op-ed in The Diplomat, Yu Xinjiang argued that Chinese society has moved to an era of self-censorship where people themselves automatically purify the internet. Okay? So in this view, censorship is so perfect and everybody knows exactly where the line is that the people themselves, when they post that 30 billion pieces of information, know exactly what to post and exactly what not to post. So this is like the opposite view on the paradox. Okay? So the answer that I'm going to put forward today and that I put forward in the book that I've just written is that it's actually something quite different. Is that censorship works for the most part, for most people, for most of the time. But it doesn't work because people are fearful. It's not this fear that purifies the internet in China. It basically works by nudging, but not forcing, users away from unsavory material. Okay? So as the Wall Street Journal op-ed noted, censorship in China is circumventable. It's actually not that hard to get around. You can use a VPN to get around the Great Firewall. You can use slightly different keywords to evade the censors. You can be really smart on the internet and get around censorship. But what he doesn't point out is that not very many people actually take advantage of this circumvention. Okay? So even though censorship is circumventable, it doesn't mean that people do it, right? So even though people are not scared of evading censorship, the reason that they don't circumvent censorship very often is because they're impatient and busy and not that interested in politics, okay? So what we know is that for the most people, most of the time, they're not willing to sort of go out of their way and spend a lot of time to inform themselves about politics. And that's true not just in China, but around the world, okay? It's one of like the main findings of political science is that people are not that interested, they're not willing to spend that much time to inform themselves about politics. And because of this, they are very affected by censorship. So sort of small costs of access to information or distractions reroute them onto the internet to different types of information. Okay? So the fact that most people are sort of unwilling to circumvent censorship allows the government to sort of pursue two strategies at once. So for most people, the government can just sort of reroute them on the internet with small costs of access or distractions. And I'll show you that with data today. But this allows the government also to focus repression or fear on particular people who are very influential. So journalists, activists, academics, people who have big impacts on the rest of the information environment are the people that the Chinese government focuses its most repression on and people that the Chinese government tries to use fear on. Okay? So it has a very targeted censorship strategy to different types of people within China. So I think Lu Wei actually says it best, which is after he has this quote about 30 billion pieces of information every day, he says, it's not possible to apply censorship to this enormous amount of data. Thus, censorship is not the correct word choice, but no censorship does not mean no management. Okay? So I think this is a really different perspective on what we usually think of as a sort of totalitarian environment where everybody is micromanaged all the time in authoritarian regimes. This is a very different notion. This is where instead the government is just trying to manage information to make people seem like they have access to information and freedom online, when in fact what the information that they are likely to come across is largely prioritized by the government. Okay? So part of the problem, I think, part of the reason why we haven't really had a really good understanding of how censorship works in China is that we lack a theory of how censorship affects people. And so what I'm going to tell you today, or try to convince you of, is that there are 3 ways in which people are affected by censorship. Okay? And you can remember them because they all start with F. Okay? So the first way that people are affected by censorship is through fear. Okay? And so this is a very particular type of censorship, which is trying to sort of deter people or make people self-censor by threatening punishment. So this is what we usually think about when we think of censorship. You're not allowed to talk about this. If you do, then certain things will happen to you. Okay? So fear is, if it's credible, it works very well from an authoritarian regime perspective, right? But the problem with it is it has to be observable in order to work. So people have to know what the threat is, and they have to be aware of it in order for them to be deterred or for them to self-censor. And so because of this, it's very dangerous for authoritarian regimes to use, particularly in the age of social media, because it can cause backlash. People don't like being censored or being constrained, right? It can also draw people toward information. So the best way to get you to go look at a web page is to be like, don't look at that web page, right? Like this is something that then draws, well, what's on that web page? I want to go look at that. And it also, interestingly, creates information gathering problems for authoritarian governments. So if everyone is too fearful in society, then they sort of tell the government whatever the government wants to hear, and then the government doesn't actually know what the problems are with governance, and they can't fix those problems. And that creates big problems for governance and for authoritarian regimes. So fear is certainly one way in which censorship can affect people, but it's problematic for authoritarian regimes to use, especially in the age of social media, where you would have to threaten, everybody, 600 million people online, which is a lot, right? So the second mechanism of censorship is friction. Okay? So this is not necessarily creating punishment for accessing or for writing information, but to just make it slightly more difficult, okay? Or slightly more costly to access. So say that I just slow down YouTube for a little bit, right? Research shows that you're very likely to switch to a different video, right? Because that leg is so annoying that you're just like not willing to wait those 3 seconds to actually watch that video, right? Or say that you go to the library and you try to check out a book, and it's just not there, right? You don't really know whether or not it's the government that's the problem, or the government that's censoring that book. It might just not be ordered, or not, like the librarian didn't think it was important, right? So the government can create friction on certain types of information, and that friction is often, unlike fear, is often invisible to people. They don't actually even notice that it's happening. So the Iranian government throttles the internet during elections. It makes it slower. But you don't know if that's the government doing that, or it's just like, the internet's having some problems today. The interesting part about friction is it also separates out activists from the masses, right? So the people who are willing to sustain the costs of friction are typically people who are really interested in that issue, or really interested in politics. And this sort of pulls away sort of this activist group from the majority of people. And the last mechanism is flooding. Okay? And so this is introducing noise or distractions in order to dilute the information environment. So most people, when they first think of it, they might not think about this as censorship, because this is actually adding information to the information environment. But I'm going to argue here that this can actually be a form of censorship if it's basically coordinated for a political reason in order to make it more difficult for people to separate out good and bad information, right? So if you add a whole bunch of noise, so for example, the Russian government has been known to add just like spam to hashtags of people who are coordinating protests, right? And that makes it much more difficult if you search on the hashtag to actually find information about the protests. So this is a form of censorship because it makes separating out good and bad information more difficult, and it makes it sort of more difficult to find the information that you're used. So flooding causes friction by adding information to the environment. It also can be very invisible. You're not really sure who's doing this. Is it some type of spammer, or is it the government? You're not really sure. And you're not even sure necessarily what it's trying to distract from, right? So what we've seen in China is, and I think around the world, is this sort of move towards censorship that relies on friction and flooding. And why is that? Well, partly it's because fear is difficult to do when you have this many people contributing to the public sphere. When now everybody has a microphone, right? Everybody has a voice in the age of social media. But friction and flooding are quite easy, actually. To add noise to the internet is not actually that hard. And also, when governments have control over the information infrastructure, it's pretty easy to add friction, right? And they're less observable, and because the internet has made people extremely impatient about their use of information, it's easy to switch to another page, switch to another substitute. People are very affected by friction and flooding for the most part. So how does this work in practice? And I'm just going to show you some examples and some data about how friction and flooding are effective on the Chinese internet and how they're used on the Chinese internet. So let's start with one example of the many censorship methods that the Chinese government uses, which is the Great Firewall, right? So the Great Firewall, as I said before, blocks foreign websites from China. So if you try to access Twitter, Google, Facebook, Bloomberg, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the list goes on, you will get like a 404 page if you're from a Chinese IP address. And so you can get around this with a VPN, with a virtual private network. So you can log into a computer outside of China and then access the internet. But it's going to be a lot slower, right? Because then you have to go through these two different computers. And so, of course, people don't really like slow internet. So you can evade this censorship, but actually very few people do. So we think that anywhere between sort of like 3 to 15% of people in China use a VPN to evade the firewall. So it's really low. And I think it's more on the 3% side, since I think the 15% side comes from online surveys, which I think are upward biased when you look at this. So I think it's more on the 3% side. Interestingly, VPN evasion is not penalized in China. You don't get in trouble for using a VPN. So this is really a form of friction. It means that you have to pay a cost. VPNs sometimes cost a little money. You have to figure this out, so it costs you a little time. You have to deal with slow internet, and so it's a friction mechanism of blocking things from the internet. So I'm going to show you some data from surveys that basically demonstrate that the firewall is really effective. Not very many people jump it. And also I'll show you some time series that when a new website gets blocked on the firewall, that a lot fewer people actually go to that website than before, because it has those big effects on what people consume on the internet. And I'll also try to persuade you that the people who jump the firewall look very different from the people who don't. So it pulls away sort of a politically interested elite, okay, from the rest of the public, so it sort of divides the Chinese public in this kind of interesting way. And the last thing I will argue is that the Great Firewall has an Achilles heel, and friction and flooding generally have an Achilles heel, which is that during particular time periods, during crisis events, or during sudden censorship, when people become aware of it, then they are willing to actually circumvent censorship during those particular time periods. So there are moments in which this censorship strategy is undermined, and that's when people are willing to seek out political information because of a crisis, and then they are willing to find out information. So who jumps the Great Firewall in China? So here's just a plot. Actually, Oh, here we go. Here is just a map of a survey that was conducted in 2015. It found that in urban areas in China, it found that about 5% of people overall jump the firewall. But that these people are really concentrated in certain areas. So in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Shenzhen near Hong Kong, right? So these are places that are much more wealthy and that are areas where people are more likely to be interacting with the outside world. And those are places where people tend to jump the firewall. There's also a big age distribution on jumping the firewall. Uh-oh. Oh, here we go. OK. So here's just a chart of, by age, the proportion of people who answered this survey question in 4 of the particular ways. So if you look at the bottom is age, and then by proportion of how they answered this survey question. They don't use the internet. They don't know what the Great Firewall is. They know about the Great Firewall, but they don't jump it. And then that they jump the Great Firewall. OK? What you see is that there are a lot of people in China who don't use the internet. About half the people in China don't use the internet, and they tend to be older. They tend to be older people. Then there are a lot of people that don't even know that the Great Firewall exists, okay? So friction is really interesting, because if you don't even know that it's happening, then you can't really do anything about it. You can't actually get around it, right? And then there are some people who know that the Great Firewall exists, but they don't jump it. And then last, there are people who jump the firewall, and most of them tend to be under 35. Okay? So most people who jump the firewall tend to be younger because they're more technology savvy and they can actually figure out ways to get around the firewall. So what are the other statistics on people who jump the firewall? So the people who jump the firewall also tend to be, have more tools to evade censorship, and they also tend to have more benefits from censorship evasion. So I'll just give you some statistics about the types of people who jump the firewall. So people are 3 times as likely to have a college degree than people who don't jump the firewall. So they're much more educated. People who they have twice the income of internet users who don't jump the firewall. Okay? 25% of people who jump the firewall said that they could speak English versus 6% of your average internet user. So they're much more likely to be able to speak English. And they also have more interest in things that you can get over the firewall, right? So 60% of people who said they jumped the firewall said that they followed international politics versus 28% of internet users, right? So not many people really are interested enough to follow international politics. And 12% worked at a foreign enterprise versus less than 1% of people who jumped the firewall. So these are types of people who are more educated, they're wealthier, they tend to interact a lot more with the international, with foreigners, right? And so they're also sort of younger and in the cities, right? So these are a really different type of people than the people who don't jump the firewall. And so basically what this does is it pulls these 2 groups away from each other, right? So people who jump the firewall are able to use Twitter and Facebook, and they're sort of in different types of online communities than people who don't jump the firewall. So when the survey asked people also, why not? Why don't you jump the firewall if you knew about the firewall but you didn't jump it? Okay? And interestingly, very few people said that they didn't jump the firewall because of fear. Only 2% of people said that they were afraid, and that's why they didn't jump the firewall. And 9% of people said because they have legal concerns. So this is a little bit of a legal gray area about jumping the firewall, but it's not really penalized, so it's not enforced at all. Most people said that they didn't jump the firewall because they didn't have any reason to. There wasn't a reason. They weren't interested enough in the things that were over the firewall to actually go over the firewall. And then about 30% of people said because it was just too annoying. They either didn't know how or it was too bothersome to jump the firewall. So that friction was just keeping them from jumping the firewall, basically. Okay? So what we see here is that really the reason why censorship is working in China, keeping very low numbers of people jumping the firewall, is not really because of fear. It's mostly just because people are impatient on the internet. They don't really have a reason to invest in searching out information, and so they're really rerouted to other types of information. So this has big impacts, big dynamic impacts on the amount that particular websites are used and the traffic that they get in China. So if you're blocked by the Great Firewall, it's going to have huge impacts on the amount of traffic that you get to your website. Okay? So I'll just show you this in a couple of plots. So the first plot is Google. So Google has had a strained relationship with China. So you guys might remember, in 2010, Google alleged that China basically hacked some of their servers. And before, so when Google was in China before of 2010, Google was basically search filtering, so they were censoring according to Chinese government regulation, which was if you're in China, you have to censor in order to continue to not be blocked by the firewall. So they decided after they were hacked that they were going to redirect their search page to the Hong Kong search page. And Hong Kong didn't have censorship, right? And so because of this, the Chinese government decided just to slow Google down, basically. And they did this for like 4 years. You go to China, you try to get on Gmail, and it would only load a certain proportion of the time. And so this is really frustrating from a user's perspective, right? Like imagine how, if your internet is slow, it's like the worst thing in the world, right? It's just so annoying, right? And everybody gets really mad. And in fact, there's all of this research that comes out of Google that shows that microseconds delays in search cost them huge amounts of money just because we're so impatient on the internet, okay? So this had big effects on traffic. So on the y-axis here is the proportion of Google traffic that comes from China. And as you can see, it went from sort of like 10 to 15% all the way down to below 5% just because it was so slow. So people decided not to use Google anymore and instead switched to domestic alternatives. And then Google was finally blocked in 2014 completely, and we see that it gets there's even less that comes, a proportion of traffic that comes from China. So this is just from Google gives you data online about, from their transparency report about how much traffic comes from each different country. So this is also true in other websites. So the other, website that has had a very fraught relationship with the Chinese government is Wikipedia, right? So Wikipedia has been on and off blocked from China for a very long time. Sort of one of the first websites to sort of have these conflicts with the Chinese government. And there are moments where Wikipedia is just blocked like one page at a time, so just particular pages that the Chinese government doesn't like are blocked. And then there are other moments where the entire website is blocked. And so basically what I did here was I took Wikipedia page view statistics. So they give you page view statistics by the hour. And on the y-axis is the total Chinese Wikipedia page views from these page view statistics. So all Chinese language Wikipedia sites. And then I knew that on May 19th of 2015 that Wikipedia was completely blocked by the Great Firewall instead of only partially blocked. And so you can look at how this impacts Wikipedia page views. All of a sudden, overnight, there are approximately 200,000 fewer page views that day than we would have expected based on the trend before. Okay? So the firewall has huge impacts on websites dynamically. It can have huge impacts overnight just because so many people are affected by it. So interestingly, the firewall, and I'll show you some data on this now, as I mentioned, it also has an Achilles heel. So it also has this sort of, it can be undermined during certain time periods. And these tend to be time periods where people, for whatever reason, there's some reason that they want to get across the firewall and are willing to pay those costs, okay? So one of these cases that I have data on is from the survey in 2015. Was conducted in the summer of 2015. And one of the places it was conducted was Tianjin, which is a city very close to Beijing in China. And what happened in August of 2015 in Tianjin was there was a huge, huge explosion in the middle of the city, in the middle of a residential area at a chemical plant. And this explosion was really, really big. So it ended up killing a lot of people and injuring a lot of people. So it was a really tragic event, sort of in the middle of the city. And it was highly visible, so people took video of the explosion and posted it on social media, and there's all of this talk on social media about the explosion. So all of a sudden, everybody is sort of sharing information about it. But of course, it was extremely confusing to people about what actually was going on. So as you can imagine, if there was a huge explosion in the middle of your city and everybody in the city is sort of viewing it, you would be wanting information about whether this is going to happen again or what happened or all of these different things. And so during that time period, the survey in 2015 was in Tianjin. It was in the field. And one of the biggest differences that we see between people who took the survey before the explosion versus after the explosion was the number of people who jumped the firewall. Okay? So if you look at the date of the Tianjin explosion here, and these are the different sort of waves of the survey, and the bubble is how many people were in that wave. And what we see is that the proportion of people who jumped the firewall is on the y-axis, is that the biggest difference between these two waves is their amount that they jumped the firewall. So people in the second wave were almost 25% percentage points more likely to jump the firewall than people in the first wave. Okay. We don't really know exactly why this is the case, but we might suspect that this is because this sort of crisis had happened within this city, and that people then were motivated to seek out information from any source that they could find, including those across the firewall. Okay. So basically what I've shown you so far is the Great Firewall, while it's circumventable, isn't actually circumvented by very many people. And the reason for that is not fear. It's not because people are afraid of jumping the firewall. It's mostly because people are just too busy, impatient, and they don't have a reason to. There's no reason to go across the firewall and find information, right, about politics. So I'm going to show you one other example. And this one is going to come from the mechanism of flooding. Okay. So it's long been rumored that the Chinese government hires hundreds of thousands of people to post information online. And these people are often called the 50-cent party. Okay? So this has been a rumor that's gone on for a really long time in China. But there's never any sort of ground truth evidence of this. Like, this is a rumor, and everybody talks about the 50-cent party, but we don't really know if they exist or what they do or anything like that. Nobody really knew about what they were doing. So recently, I wrote a paper with my co-authors, Gary King and Jennifer Pan. And we basically found the first sort of systematic data about the Chinese 50-cent party and tried to figure out, okay, what were they doing? And what were they doing online? Okay. And so the way that we did this is there was a blogger who posted this leaked email archive from a local propaganda office in Jiangxi province. That contained emails between the propaganda office and people who were posting online at the direction of the propaganda office. And so what these emails, and so this is just the network of this email archive. Basically, like, the internet propaganda office is in the middle, and these on the outside are sort of all these commentators that are reporting in and being like, hey, I did my job and I posted this thing online. And then they had these lists in their emails of like all of the things that they posted online for, like, I completed my assignment, turned it in, right? So this was sort of like this interaction between the assigner and the assignment. Okay. And so this is a really large and unstructured data set. So there were over 2,000 emails in this data, and about half of them contained posts that people were reporting in that they had posted. And overall, actually within this, so we went through it and we got every single post that we could get from this email archive. And overall, we collected over 40,000 posts within this email archive that people had reported that they had posted online. So this allowed us to sort of take a look at what the 50-cent party was doing, right? What were they posting online, and when were they posting online, et cetera. And the prevailing view of scholars and activists and journals and pundits, people in social media, were that the 50-cent party sort of argues and debates with their critics. So if you criticize the Chinese government online, the 50-cent party would sort of like come after you and tell you why you were wrong and try to like pick a fight with you, right? But what we found was that overwhelmingly this was not true, that the 50-cent party does not argue and does not engage on controversial issues. Okay? What they mostly try to do is to distract and redirect public attention from sensitive events and sensitive time periods to cheerleading, what we call cheerleading, and positive valence issues. So just saying really positive things online, okay? So the topics of the posts that we found were overwhelmingly cheerleading posts, okay? So this is sort of things like "Way to go, China," or like "Way to go, Guangzhou," which is like this local county where the propaganda office was, or even things that didn't have to do with the government, but were just like inspirational quotes or like things like that they posted online. Okay. Or things about revolutionary martyrs, so like the revolution or the history of the CCP, and like really nice things about these people. And we even used some machine learning algorithms to predict outside of this local area what other posts on the Chinese web were 50-cent party posts. And we found the same thing, which was that most of these posts were just sharing really nice things about the Chinese government and not really engaging with their critics. So we found very few posts that really engaged with critics. And so we estimated, using this archive, that there are about 500 million posts from the 50-cent party on the Chinese internet every year. So this is the plot of what these posts look like, which is also really interesting. These are the over 40,000 posts that came from the Internet Archive. And what's interesting about this plot, so here on the x-axis is date from January of 2013 to December of 2014. And what's interesting about this plot is that the 50-cent party posts are concentrated during particular time periods, okay? So what that means is that it's like all of a sudden everybody, like there's this huge injection of 50-cent party posts into the social media sphere. And we found that they tend to happen during sort of sensitive events. So this is like political meetings that the CCP is holding, or riots that happen in this case in Western China. So but even though they don't actually talk about these meetings necessarily, there's this sort of injection of positivity during this time period, or distraction during this time period. So does it work? So I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about a very small study of whether or not this actually has an impact of the amount of information about a certain type on the internet. So you might think, 3,000 posts, that's just not very many in comparison to 30 billion pieces of information every day, right? So I'm going to talk to you about the Qingming Festival, which is here on the first burst. Okay, so the Qingming Festival is a holiday, it's like a festival in China, which is the tomb sweeping festival. So this is a time period where people pay respects to their ancestors. Okay, and it happens every April. And this festival is a little problematic for the Chinese government because it's actually, for the most part, it wasn't celebrated a lot under Mao. But it also has sparked political protests in the past. So in 1976, people were mourning Zhou Enlai during Qingming, and it led to this big Tiananmen incident in 1976. We know that sort of relatives of victims of the 1989 Tiananmen student protests are sort of under supervision right before Qingming most years, because there's this worry that by respecting people who have died, it would become sort of a political situation. So this is a little bit of a problematic holiday for the Chinese government. So what the Chinese government is trying to do, and what we know not only from this archive, but also from other sort of people who are following what the Chinese government is doing, is they're trying to take back the Qingming Festival and redirect attention within Qingming to something else. So most of these posts within this burst are not about just Qingming by itself, but they're about how Qingming is a time period to pay respects to the martyrs of the revolution of the CCP. Okay? So this is a time period where you go and celebrate the people who brought the CCP to power, basically. So, and we see that all of these posts are like this. Like, Qingming is the day where we relive the fire of the revolution and we commune with the martyrs, right? Or Qingming is a time period where we go and pay respects to the martyrs, or long live the martyrs, etc. Okay. So just to try to understand, and this is a more recent tack, and certainly online propaganda is sort of a recent, has become a focus recently under the Xi administration. And just to try to understand if this works, I took this random sample of posts during the Qingming Festival in 2012, and 2013, and 2014, and 2015, and looked at how many of these posts that mentioned Qingming also mentioned the martyrs. Okay? And what I found was that there's been a big increase over time of the number of people who are framing Qingming in terms of the martyrs. So in 2012, there are not very many posts at all that talk about Qingming with the martyrs. But then you get up to almost 3 to 4% of posts, like 1 in 25 posts, that are talking about the martyrs with Qingming. So even though overall the 50 Cent Party can't post that many things online, right? They have sort of this ballooning effect on the blogosphere, which is basically just changing the frame of a holiday, or changing the frame of what people are talking about. Okay. So flooding can have a big impact on the way that people discuss issues, even current events online, and think about them. So what have I showed you so far? So far what I've showed you is that the Chinese government's strategy of censorship is to sort of distract and divert people away from information using friction and flooding. And that fear, which is also used in China, is really targeted toward influential people. So we see, certainly fear is something that's used, but social media users who get jailed or arrested typically are people with really large followings or people with a lot of influence. For the most part, censorship is, friction and flooding are used for like your average individual. So, so these sort of small barriers of access or well-timed distractions really distract and divert people away from certain types of information. So I just want to end with some just thoughts and questions about what this means for democracy, right? And this is one of the things that the Carlsberg Foundation wanted me to sort of think about, and maybe we can start a discussion about it. So this is the way that I think about this. So traditionally, scholars have sort of drawn a stark contrast between freedom of speech in autocracies and democracies, right? Democracy, freedom of speech is sort of fundamental to democracy. And in democracies around the world, for the most part, freedom of expression is protected. So the government can't punish or prevent you from saying something in the public sphere. So they can't use fear to deter you or to punish you for speaking in the public sphere. And autocracies are different, right? Because they have certainly used a lot of fear, and they certainly allow themselves to use a lot of fear to punish people for speaking in the public sphere. So I would argue that the introduction of digital media has made this contrast between democracies and autocracies less stark than it was before. And the reason for this is because as more and more people around the world in both types of countries have begun to participate in the public sphere through social media, the contest over free speech is not as much about whether someone can take the public stage and talk, but rather which voices rise to the top and which are shifted to the bottom, right? So you can certainly write what you want on social media, but if nobody ever sees that because an algorithm puts it at the bottom of the pile, then it doesn't really matter that you wrote that, right? Or it doesn't matter as much as maybe another person. So censorship, and what I'm arguing in this talk, is that censorship consists not only of preventing individuals from speaking, but also of determining how their speech is prioritized online. And if it's prioritized for a political reason, then we can think about that as similar to a lot of these censorship methods in autocracies. So in both types of governments, political entities have enormous amounts of power over how information is organized in the public sphere, right? So we know that corporations wield a lot of influence over algorithms of online search, right? And if those became political, that would be sort of problematic, right, for the way that we think about freedom of speech. And any organized group now, political parties or anybody who has enough resources and interest, can use flooding of their internet to just basically try to create enough noise to sort of crowd out a certain conversation or make it difficult for people to figure out what good and bad information is online. So not only can information sort of be similarly manipulated in democracies and autocracies because friction and flooding are sort of matter a lot more now than they did before, but also that citizens in democracies are very similarly influenced by these manipulations, right? So political science scholars have long documented for a long, long time that people everywhere, citizens around the world, are what we call rationally ignorant. And what that means is that because citizens are not typically pivotal in any political situation, like even in a democracy, your vote is not likely to like change the outcome of an election. You're not going to spend very much time informing yourself about politics. And so what we see around the world is people just don't spend that much time thinking, reading, and informing themselves about politics. For the most part. Of course, there are exceptions, like probably you guys, since you were all here. But for the most part, around the world, people don't inform themselves about politics. And what this means is that small barriers to access, just like we've seen in China, sort of around the world, small costs of access can have big impacts on the types of things that people consume, and both in democracies and in autocracies. So my work in China sort of suggests is that this broader definition of censorship means that we need to sort of concern ourselves with sort of how we define censorship in democracies. So it's not just about whether someone has the ability to write their own opinion and publish it. If that is sort of deprioritized, then that doesn't end up mattering as much. So we need to concern ourselves with how information is prioritized for the public. Why do you see certain information more than others in your social networks? Why do you see certain information more than others online? And so without asking sort of these hard questions of ourselves in democracies, we run the risk of making ourselves sort of unwittingly subjects of similar forces that prioritize information in authoritarian environments, which I think is something that's very surprising for people when you think about it in democracies. So what I've shown you today is that even without fear, even without this punishment for freedom of expression, small costs and barriers to information have huge effects on what people read. And when these barriers are implemented in a politically motivated way, like they are in China, they basically constitute censorship. And so we should really think deeply about this in our own society and in our own way. And so I'll leave you with that sort of open-ended ending, and we can talk more about what this means. Thank you.